A screech split the calm morning air as a tow truck's steel cable latched onto the front bumper of what looked like a matte black armored vehicle. The words "Bomb Squad" were emblazoned in bold white along the side, and behind its tinted windshield sat enough emergency tech to rival a small war room. Karen stood next to it with a clipboard in one hand and her phone camera in the other, narrating her crusade with all the grace of a morning news anchor gone rogue. She gestured dramatically to the truck like she was unveiling a bomb to an audience of toddlers and gasped into her phone microphone as she yelled, "This vehicle is a terrorist threat. I am executing a citizen's tow for the safety of this entire block." Across the street, a man burst from his front door wearing flannel pajama pants, untied boots, and a shirt that simply read "Yodi Technician." His expression froze between disbelief and restrained rage as he sprinted toward the scene yelling, "Do not touch that truck, it's wired with security protocols. This isn't a car, it's a classified federal vehicle." Karen stepped directly into his path and said, "You can't just park military death machines in family neighborhoods." He pointed at his badge and tried to explain who he was, but she shoved her clipboard between them and screamed, "Impersonating federal agents is a felony." The tow truck started to tighten the hook until a deep robotic voice blared from within the vehicle system, locked, "Potential explosive threat detected, evacuate perimeter." Karen shrieked as the words "live ordnance" flashed in red across the digital windshield. A neighbor ducked behind a recycling bin, another one ran for his garage, and Karen just stood there frozen, caught between triumphant delusion and the slow creeping realization that she might have to explain all this to someone wearing a real badge later. Just 3 weeks earlier I had moved into this neighborhood at the edge of suburban comfort and unspoken HOA tyranny, a decent place, a good school district, and relatively quiet evenings filled with dog walkers and barbecue smoke floating lazily over fences. My name is Mike Henderson. I'm a bomb technician for the State Response Unit, and I live about 3 streets away from our city's emergency depot. Normally, I wouldn't keep the truck at home, but after the last string of bomb scares in nearby counties, our division chief ordered on-call specialists to park at home to cut down response times. We had letters signed by the mayor, county sheriff, and even state homeland security to make sure there were no issues. Apparently none of those endorsements meant anything to Karen. I first met her when I was dragging my trash bins to the curb. She approached like a hawk with a neighborhood watch badge that didn't exist and eyes scanning me like a TSA agent who smelled something off. "Sir, is that your vehicle?" she asked, pointing to my parked bomb truck. I explained politely that yes, it was my assigned emergency response unit and that I was a certified technician under contract with multiple federal agencies. She squinted at me like I had just claimed to be a unicorn technician and said, "We'll see about that," before stomping away like she owned asphalt. The first complaint came the next day, a red notice stuck to my mailbox with tape, the kind meant for sealing ductwork. It said in looping passive-aggressive handwriting, "Your vehicle violates aesthetic harmony and causes fear in minor children. HOA Bylaws Section 7.14a." I read that section 3 times. It didn't exist. Karen, however, treated it like the Constitution. Every 2 days, she added something new: loud tires, suspicious antennas, hazard decals designed to incite anxiety. My team laughed when I told them I started keeping a file. I named it Karen vs. Logic Volume 1. The HOA board wasn't any help. Most of them seemed tired of Karen but too afraid to say anything. They nodded and murmured whenever she spoke, and I could see in their eyes the calculation that it was easier to let her burn out than confront her. They told me things like, "Technically she's just voicing concerns, and let's not escalate things." When she showed up to a board meeting with a printed stack of photos of my truck labeled "Neighborhood Destabilizer" in Comic Sans font, I had to step outside to keep from laughing in her face. Then came the morning of the tow. I was inside eating oatmeal watching a documentary about failed detonators when I heard the grinding noise of the cable. I ran outside half-dressed and saw her standing next to the truck, arms folded, smug as a cat in a birdcage. I tried reasoning. I showed her my laminated credentials, my authorization letter, even my badge, but she just shouted louder, calling me a poser, claiming I was some sort of prepper hoarder with a homemade armored vehicle. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The moment the tow truck activated the hook, the onboard security kicked in, sensors detected unauthorized tampering, and the truck's defense system lit up, red lights, spinning sirens, warbling a recorded voice announcing security breach. I screamed at the tow driver to stop. He jumped back and nearly twisted his ankle as the vehicle's auto lockdown engaged. The wheels locked, the doors sealed, and a high-voltage deterrent warning flashed across the rear bumper. Karen screamed, not because she was scared but because her fantasy was collapsing. Her video feed cut off as the neighbor kids ran out with their phones and started recording. Police are on their way, she yelled triumphantly, thinking she'd just executed a national security arrest. In her mind, she had just saved the suburbs from a rogue bomb truck with bad parking. But I had already called my supervisor, who'd been tracking the vehicle's sensor alert in real time. Within minutes, 2 unmarked federal SUVs rolled up. One of them, my direct commanding officer, stepped out, looked at Karen, then looked at the truck, and said, "Oh, not another HOA incident this week." Karen still didn't back down, even as they showed her the real paperwork and the federal seal. She insisted we were lying and demanded we all be tested for performance-enhancing drugs because, and I quote, "normal people don't react that fast." That day was the beginning of a ridiculous war I never signed up for. I had defused car bombs under bridges and dealt with unstable chemical rigs in abandoned storage units, but nothing prepared me for the blast radius of pure entitlement. Karen wasn't just a meddling neighbor, she was a full-blown neighborhood tyrant with an ego wired to explode at the first hint of logic. The crazy part was that she wasn't done. She thought she had won a battle, but what she didn't know was that the bomb she had pulled on had just started its timer, and I wasn't the one about to go off. And the neighborhood was watching closely, every phone camera, every whispered chat, every raised eyebrow behind blinds. The moment Karen tried to tow a bomb squad truck on camera, she lit the fuse that would make this quiet suburb the hottest HOA zone in the country, and I was just getting started. By the time the police pulled up, Karen had already rehearsed her entire speech. She pointed at my truck with theatrical flair and began explaining to the officers how she had courageously stopped what she called a rogue vehicle carrying suspected armaments, right in the heart of a peaceful suburban community. The younger officer glanced at her, then at the clearly marked Bomb Squad logo on the side of the truck, and exchanged a silent "what is this?" look with his partner. I stepped forward, handed over my ID, my certification, and the signed citywide emergency vehicle exemption. The officers looked over the papers, nodded, and one of them quietly asked if everything was okay with the truck's sensors. I confirmed that the vehicle had simply triggered its tamper protocol due to an unauthorized tow attempt, but everything was under control. Karen, not pleased with being ignored, inserted herself between us and waved her phone at the officers, saying loudly that I was impersonating a government official and might be mentally unstable. It would have been funny if it weren't so outrageously insulting. I had served in explosive ordnance disposal for over 12 years, with commendations for incidents I still couldn't legally talk about. To be accused of being a fraud by a woman who thought the HOA bylaws superseded federal emergency codes was like being told by a goldfish how to breathe underwater. The police, to their credit, remained professional. They reminded Karen that tampering with a federally issued emergency vehicle could be considered obstruction of a state or federal operation. Her response was to gasp and declare that they too were now part of the conspiracy. Her exact words were, "I knew you'd all cover for each other, you're probably all in on it with him." When asked who she meant by him, she said it like it was a courtroom reveal, "the bomb guy." I swear one of the officers actually rolled his eyes. By the next day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Videos of Karen's tirade were circulating in group chats, on social media, and had somehow even made it to a TikTok compilation channel called HOA Insanity. One clip in particular, where she yelled, "This is my community and I demand an evacuation," while ducking behind a bush, had already reached over 200,000 views. I started getting texts from old colleagues saying they saw me online and couldn't believe I was now famous for dealing with a suburban detonation of pure ego. Karen, however, saw the growing attention not as a sign to calm down but as validation. She began acting like a self-declared whistleblower, telling neighbors I was part of a shadow military network placing weapons in residential zones. She wore sunglasses everywhere, started talking into a Bluetooth earpiece that was never on, and began referring to herself in the third person. Things escalated when she attempted to contact Homeland Security directly. She sent them a letter riddled with made-up codes, random acronyms, and screenshots of my vehicle from various angles, annotated with red circles and arrows like a conspiracy board. One page simply read "Unknown device antenna, could be mind beam." She signed the letter Karen V. Sutherland, Civilian Intelligence Analyst, self-appointed. Unsurprisingly, Homeland Security did not take her seriously. What they did take seriously was the fact that she'd forged an official-looking seal on her letter using clipart from a website. I was contacted shortly afterward by an agent who was both confused and slightly amused. He asked if I was aware someone in my neighborhood was impersonating federal channels. I said if he meant Karen, I was very aware. What worried me wasn't just Karen's delusions but how quickly she managed to convince the HOA board that something had to be done about me. She stood up at the next board meeting and made a full presentation titled Operation Residential Integrity. She claimed I was a risk to children, that my truck was parked too close to the community playground, and that the blinking light on the dashboard could cause panic attacks in seniors. One board member asked if she had any proof, and she handed out pamphlets. Not documents, not printouts. Pamphlets with glossy photos, hand-drawn symbols, and a quote from a fictional HOA expert she made up named Dr. Stanley Homeworth. The kicker was when she played a looped video of the truck's tamper alert and claimed it was an intimidation tactic I used to silence dissenters. The board, a collection of half-retired professionals and people who clearly just wanted their HOA discounts on landscaping services, sat in silence. When I got up to speak, I was calm. I explained the nature of my work, how my vehicle had to be parked close to home for time-sensitive response purposes, and how every aspect of it had been cleared by both city and federal authorities. I handed them copies of the same documents I'd given the police. One member nodded and said thank you. Another asked if I could move it a few feet to the left so it wasn't directly in line with her garden gnome. But Karen was furious. She stood up again and yelled, "He's lying to all of you, you're being manipulated, this is how it starts." Someone asked her how what started, and she said the militarization of suburbia. I wish I were joking. A few days later, 2 men in black suits appeared at my door. But these weren't agents responding to Karen's ramblings. They were there because I had reported the fact that my plates had been removed and reattached incorrectly, which suggested tampering. It was likely someone had tried to scan them or photograph the undercarriage. One of the agents chuckled and said, "We've seen HOA cases go nuts before, but this lady's taken the cake and eaten the bakery." Karen watched from her window as they interviewed me. Within the hour, she was back on the community forum posting that federal agents had arrived to arrest me. She even posted a photo of one of the SUVs and tagged it with suspicious activity, resolved thanks to my vigilance. She truly believed she was saving the neighborhood from an inside threat. That same week, the tow truck driver who had nearly triggered a full security lockdown of my vehicle submitted a complaint of his own. According to his statement, Karen had misled him into thinking he was removing an abandoned RV from city property. She had forged a removal order on HOA letterhead and promised him cash under the table. The driver, clearly spooked after the alarms went off and the warnings blared about explosives, was done. He filed a report for harassment and refused to ever service the neighborhood again. I reached out to him, offered him a coffee, and he told me he'd never seen anything like that truck before. When I asked if he believed Karen's story about it being a homemade rig, he laughed and said, "I've hauled everything from circus trailers to government cars. That ain't homemade. That's straight up federal. Whatever she's smoking, it ain't legal." Back in the neighborhood, tensions were rising. Some residents started avoiding Karen altogether, others whispered about her behind closed doors. But she didn't back down. She doubled her efforts. She started handing out flyers about neighborhood security and warning signs of covert militarization. One flyer included a drawing of me with laser beams coming out of my eyes. She left that one on my windshield. I kept it. Not as evidence, just as a reminder that no matter how ridiculous things got, this was far from over. By the end of the week, it wasn't just the neighborhood talking. Local news vans rolled into the cul-de-sac like they were covering a disaster zone. Camera crews tiptoed past neatly trimmed hedges and garden gnomes as if they might stumble on a landmine. The headline spreading through every outlet was a flavor of absurd only HOA Karen could cook up. Local hero bomb tech harassed by HOA over suspicious vehicle. It didn't help that the video of Karen screaming about a terrorist truck had now crossed over to national TikTok pages. A military meme account had dubbed it with dramatic music and labeled her the suburban general. Every time I opened my phone, there she was, mid-screech, flailing dramatically, accusing the government of building a missile silo on her street. Karen, however, took the attention as proof of her moral high ground. She held her own press conference from her driveway, standing in front of a folding table with a handwritten sign that read Neighborhood Security Watch. There were no actual members in the group except her. She wore mirrored sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat, pacing like she was about to announce a Senate run. I watched from my porch while sipping coffee, genuinely impressed by the level of confidence it took to accuse Homeland Security of ignoring a real threat because they were deeply infiltrated by truck sympathizers. She had a friend film the entire event on a cracked phone while another neighbor's lawn sprinkler soaked her ankle-length skirt. When a reporter asked what actual threat I posed, Karen snapped that my truck gave off low-frequency brain waves that interfered with community harmony. Meanwhile, I remained calm, quiet, and cooperative. I issued no statements, gave no interviews, and refused to engage on the community forums where Karen now wrote hourly updates about my alleged crimes. One post featured a grainy zoom-in of my truck's antenna labeled as unknown surveillance device. Another showed my dog in the front seat with the caption, "Canines used in psychological intimidation." I wish I could say I made that up, but I saved that one too. Even the HOA board, previously content to let Karen run her imaginary kingdom, began to grow uneasy. A few members quietly reached out to apologize. One of them, an elderly woman named June, brought me a lemon pie and whispered that she never trusted someone who wears sunglasses after sundown. Then came the moment I realized things were far more serious than I thought. I received a letter from the state emergency office informing me that someone had submitted an official complaint stating I had been storing live ordnance in a residential neighborhood. Not simulated, not inert training materials, live. That's a federal-level accusation. I immediately called the department and found out the report was anonymous but filled with Karen's usual language. Threat to children, military infiltration, truck fortress. She had crossed the line. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was career-threatening sabotage. Instead of confronting her, I called in backup. My old squadmate, Lyle, now worked as a liaison between the mayor's office and emergency services. Lyle had seen combat, riots, blackouts, and one guy tried to defuse a firecracker with salad tongs, but when I told him about Karen, he laughed and said suburban warfare was worse than any war zone. He showed up the next morning in uniform, greeted Karen politely, and asked her for a statement. She told him she was under no obligation to cooperate with federal deep state pawns and demanded he show his badge number in triplicate. He smiled, thanked her for her input, then walked with me to the HOA clubhouse where he calmly informed the board that submitting false reports about tactical vehicle storage could lead to both civil and criminal charges. Karen wasn't happy. She called an emergency HOA meeting and declared herself interim president after the real president mysteriously fell ill. She started every sentence with the phrase "as a protector of community wellness" and ended them with vague threats about legal teams. Her proposal was absurd. Ban all emergency response vehicles from the neighborhood unless pre-approved by a new HOA oversight committee. That committee, of course, would be chaired by Karen. When asked what would happen during an actual emergency, she responded with the chilling confidence of someone who had read too many spy thrillers and too few real policies. She said that if anything blew up, it would be our fault for allowing it in the first place. In the middle of the meeting, someone finally stood up. It was Tom, a quiet guy who worked nights and mostly kept to himself. He looked around the room and said, "This is insane. I don't want to die in a fire because Karen doesn't like decals." The room went silent. Even a few board members nodded. Karen glared at him and said, "You'll regret siding with the truck." She had started talking about my vehicle like it was a sentient entity planning to overthrow the local grocery store. That week, in a stroke of either madness or misguided brilliance, Karen set up cones at the entrance to the block and declared a neighborhood lockdown. She wore a reflective vest and waved down passing cars with a whistle, demanding to inspect trunks for contraband. When someone asked her what she was looking for, she said materials of emotional instability. At one point, she stopped a teenager on a bicycle and asked if he'd been recruited into my militant vehicle cult. His answer was to roll his eyes and post the whole thing online. The video hit 500,000 views before sundown. But the tipping point came during what would later be known as the dummy incident. I had a training dummy in the back of my truck used for explosive simulations. It was clearly labeled inert in bright red letters. While I was unloading groceries one evening, Karen marched across my lawn, opened the rear door of the vehicle, which she had no authority to touch, and grabbed the dummy. She began running through the neighborhood, holding it over her head, screaming, "I've got the bomb, I've got the bomb." People poured out of their homes. One man dropped his sandwich. A kid started crying. Karen sprinted like it was the Olympic torch run, and she'd lost her mind somewhere around the halfway mark. She didn't get far. 2 houses down, she was intercepted by Frank, a retired Marine who had seen the dummy being used during drills before. He stepped in front of her, arms folded, and said, "Ma'am, that's a mannequin." Karen screamed he's with them too and tried to juke left. Frank gently placed one hand on her shoulder, and she collapsed like she'd been tossed by common sense. She lay in a neighbor's lawn, panting, yelling something about military puppets and suburban infiltration. Her dramatic collapse ended with a sprinkler turning on and soaking her entire backside. It would have been funny if it hadn't been terrifying how far she was willing to go. That night, I got a knock on the door. It was Officer Rayburn from earlier. He looked tired and said, "You're gonna want to come to the station tomorrow. She's filing another complaint, but this time she's saying your truck broadcast frequencies that induced hallucinations." I stared at him for a second, then asked if I could borrow the bodycam footage. He laughed and said, "Oh, you'll want it for the trial or the memoir." By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, people weren't just showing up with notepads and folding chairs, they were bringing popcorn. What used to be sleepy Thursday night discussions about mailbox paint and sidewalk cracks had transformed into a weekly neighborhood showdown, and Karen was always at the center of it. She walked into the clubhouse with her clipboard held like a gavel and a giant binder labeled evidence. It looked less like a community forum and more like the setup to a daytime courtroom drama. The tension in the room was thick, not because anyone actually believed her, but because no one could guess what she was going to say next. People didn't come to hear proposals anymore, they came to witness whatever explosion she was about to set off, metaphorically or otherwise. Before the meeting even started, I handed a formal letter to the board, a cease and desist order, reviewed and cleared by state legal counsel, citing harassment, tampering with federal property, and filing of knowingly false reports. I didn't say much. I just nodded, gave them the packet, and sat down near the back with my arms crossed. Karen looked at the board, then at me, and scoffed like I had just handed them a grocery list. When the president, who had returned from his conveniently timed illness, opened the letter and began reading the charges, Karen stood up abruptly and said, "None of this is legal." You people are being manipulated by a very dangerous individual with unknown military affiliations. She then reached into her giant binder and pulled out a printed sheet with an exaggerated photo of my face that had been altered to make it look like I was scowling under infrared heat vision. She claimed it was proof I had used thermal scans on her property. The room was dead silent for a moment, then someone in the back coughed awkwardly. The board president asked her to sit down and let the legal advisor speak. Karen refused. She yelled that her rights were being violated and that she would represent herself as her own legal authority if it came to that. That's when she brought in her secret weapon, a man in a dusty gray suit with a coffee-stained tie and a name badge that read Paralegal Consultant. She introduced him with theatrical grandeur, calling him a legal strategist who specialized in residential policy warfare. The man stood up, nodded solemnly, and began reading from what turned out to be a monologue he had printed off a public blog. Someone in the front row quietly whispered to the person next to them, "That guy was in the community theater production of Guys and Dolls last fall." Sure enough, it was her niece's friend, a part-time actor and full-time barista who had no legal experience beyond watching courtroom dramas and quoting movie lines. When he tried to cite fictional amendments, the board had had enough. They asked him to leave. He refused, citing a non-existent section of the HOA bylaws that gave him freedom of counsel within interpretive forums. Security was called. Not police, just the volunteer guy who watched the pool gate on weekends, and Karen began screaming that this was a coup. That was the word she used, like we were overthrowing a government instead of asking her to stop stalking my truck. She stormed out, promising lawsuits, protests, and a press release. Her actor lawyer followed behind, muttering something about character assassination. Later that week, half the board resigned. One member stood up during the emergency session and declared, "I'm not going to jail because some woman thinks antennas are death rays." Another just walked out silently and never came back. With the board gutted and the neighborhood at a boiling point, Karen saw her opportunity. She marched around handing out flyers claiming she was the rightful interim leader of the HOA and that she would be enforcing emergency moral regulations until further notice. Her first order of business was banning truck-related activities. No parking large vehicles, no antenna installations, and no emergency decals. When asked if that included ambulances or fire trucks, she shrugged and said the rules are the rules. But she was about to get blindsided. You see, all this time I'd been working quietly behind the scenes with a very particular department. I had filed to have my street reclassified as an emergency access zone for disaster response vehicles. After everything Karen had done, blocking access, tampering with equipment, and attempting to tow a federally tagged unit, the city had taken notice. The paperwork cleared, and I received confirmation that my home was now listed under an active state protection clause, stripping the HOA of any authority over how the vehicle was used, parked, or displayed. It also gave me clearance to install monitoring equipment to ensure compliance with state regulations, including cameras facing outward from my driveway. When Karen woke up the next day and saw the bright yellow sign installed by the city that read Emergency Response Access Zone, unauthorized actions subject to penalty, she nearly lost her mind. She ran up to the sign with gardening shears and tried to snip the metal bolt. A neighbor captured the entire meltdown on video, her yanking, swearing, stomping, and finally dropping her shears in frustration. The video hit the HOA community group within minutes. Comments exploded. One resident asked if anyone knew how to file for a restraining order against a fellow homeowner. Another posted a meme of Karen photoshopped into a tank, captioned Residential Warfare Level 99. But I wasn't finished. With my street now immune to HOA overreach, I sent a second notice to the board detailing the consequences of further interference. I also filed a formal complaint about Karen's fake security checkpoint stunt and her violation of private property when she took the training dummy. These weren't just HOA violations, they were criminal. The sheriff's office took interest and began quietly gathering statements. Karen had no idea the law was now watching her more closely than I ever had. She still thought she was winning, still handing out her homemade infraction notices like parking tickets at a tailgate party. She posted new signs around her yard warning of surveillance drones, claimed she had installed a noise field to block my truck's mind control signals, and even started painting her fence with what she called electromagnetic blocking paint. Then came the final blow. One morning, Karen marched down to the HOA clubhouse, ready to issue new declarations. But the locks were gone. The signage was removed. The doors were chained shut with an official city notice stapled across them. The property had been reclaimed temporarily by the city for review due to repeated misuse of community power and failure to maintain neutral governance. In other words, they shut it down because Karen had turned it into her personal war room. She stood there, slack-jawed, reading the notice over and over again like it might change. When the HOA vice president, one of the few sane ones left, walked past her and casually said, "Guess you shouldn't have tried to arrest a bomb technician," she didn't have a comeback. For the first time in months, Karen didn't speak. She just stood there, blinking at the sign, gripping her clipboard so tightly the corner bent in her hand. A week after the clubhouse was officially shuttered and Karen's stranglehold on the HOA collapsed, the neighborhood felt different. There was a calmness in the air, like the tension that had gripped every fence-line conversation and front porch whisper had finally lifted. People walked their dogs again without glancing over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes past my driveway and waved like nothing had ever happened. Even the air smelled cleaner, although that might have just been the lingering aroma of the cookout I was preparing. I had decided to throw a neighborhood barbecue as a thank you, not just for the few brave souls who'd spoken up, but for the entire community that had quietly endured a months-long siege under Karen's erratic rule. It wasn't revenge. It was relief. Celebration. Closure. The grill was already going strong by late afternoon. I'd backed the bomb squad truck into the driveway like a centerpiece display, decked out with red, white, and blue bunting across the front grille. Someone had brought balloons. A neighbor's kid had stuck googly eyes on the side mirror and taped a sign to the hood that read Neighborhood Guardian. One of the dads set up a cornhole game, and a few people brought lawn chairs over to the edge of my driveway like we were tailgating for a small-town parade. It wasn't long before the entire cul-de-sac was filled with neighbors who just wanted to enjoy the kind of afternoon that hadn't felt possible while Karen ruled from behind her clipboard. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker, the scent of grilled ribs hung in the breeze, and every few minutes someone stopped by to shake my hand or thank me. I kept telling them I didn't do anything heroic. I just parked my truck, did my job, and refused to let nonsense win. But they knew better. They knew what it took to stand your ground when the pressure came from every direction, especially when that pressure came wrapped in suburban entitlement and disguised as community concern. More than once, I heard someone whisper, "I can't believe she really thought it was a bomb truck," and I had to bite my lip not to laugh. And then, because every great finale needs one last act, Karen appeared. She came creeping around the corner wearing a wide-brimmed hat, oversized sunglasses, and a black trench coat that billowed in the light wind like she thought it made her invisible. She looked like someone poorly disguised for a stakeout in a cartoon. She made it halfway down the street before someone shouted out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is that Karen dressed like she's in the Matrix?" That broke the tension. Laughter rippled across the crowd. Someone coughed to hide it, someone else snapped a photo. But the mood never soured. We had already won. She was just part of the closing credits now. Karen made her way to the edge of the lawn, eyeing the grill like she might call in a fire hazard complaint at any second. She stopped, crossed her arms, and sniffed loudly. Someone offered her a hot dog with extra mustard. She didn't answer. Her eyes locked onto the bomb squad truck, and she muttered something about government intimidation through festive decoration. I was about to ignore her completely when she took 2 cautious steps forward and barked out just loud enough to be heard by a few nearby people, "You are breaking federal grilling codes." That was when the sheriff walked in. Sheriff Dalton was a tall man with a booming laugh, a bald head that glistened in the sun, and the kind of handshake that made people stand straighter. He wasn't in uniform, but no one had to guess who he was. He'd served in the military before becoming county sheriff, and had been my commanding officer during my first explosive ordnance deployment overseas. He wasn't just a friend, he was family by fire. When he saw Karen, he smiled the kind of smile that meant trouble was about to be handled, but gently. He stepped beside me, shook my hand, and said, "I figured if you're gonna throw a party, I'd better be the one to make sure the barbecue's up to code." Karen's eyes went wide. She recognized him. Maybe not by name, but she recognized the way the crowd quieted when he spoke. She tried to say something, maybe to protest, maybe to warn him about the vehicle that had haunted her paranoia for weeks. But before she could, Sheriff Dalton raised one hand and addressed the whole block. "I've seen a lot in my years. War zones, hurricanes, criminals that think they're smarter than the law. But I have never seen a man get treated like a threat for simply parking his work truck at home. This man," he gestured to me, "has put his life on the line to protect this country and this county. He's a bomb tech. He's family. And he's exactly the kind of neighbor anyone would be lucky to have." Applause erupted. Not the polite golf clap of board meetings, but real, full-on cheering. People stood up. Kids shouted. One guy whistled so loud it probably echoed 2 blocks over. Karen tried to speak again, raising one hand like she was about to object in a courtroom. But no one was listening. Not anymore. The story wasn't hers to tell. That day also marked the moment Karen's official downfall began. While the barbecue rolled on, a process server showed up. Quiet guy, khakis, clipboard, polite voice. He walked up to Karen, confirmed her name, and handed her a thick envelope. She opened it and began reading while standing directly in front of the bomb truck that she once tried to tow away in a crusade of ignorance. It was a restraining order. Several neighbors had filed together, citing harassment, public endangerment, and repeated abuse of position under a homeowner association. By the next week, her house had a "for sale" sign in the yard. Whether she was forced out or left voluntarily was never clear. What we did know was that within a month, it sold to a young military family who had just moved back from overseas. A Navy vet and his wife, both beaming with energy and excited to finally live somewhere peaceful. The first thing they did was paint the fence Karen had written conspiracy slogans on. The second thing they did was plant a small American flag garden in the yard with a little solar-powered light that made it glow at night. The third thing? They invited me and a few other neighbors over for lemonade. No complaints, no agendas, just smiles. And finally there was the video, the original clip of Karen's meltdown, complete with her yelling about the bomb truck and screaming at officers, had now crossed 5 million views. People turned it into memes, reaction clips, even a parody musical. One user edited it into a rap battle between HOA Karen and the truck itself. I didn't say much online, but every once in a while, I'd see my face pop up as the calm guy in the chaos. The guy who didn't yell back. The guy who just let the truth speak louder than the nonsense. That was the legacy I never asked for, but one I was fine with. Karen had tried to blow up my reputation, and instead, she made it bulletproof. The HOA war was over. The truck still sat in my driveway, silent, immovable, official. And every morning, I walked past it, coffee in hand, smiling at the empty street. Because sometimes the biggest explosions don't come from bombs. They come from watching arrogance collapse under the weight of its own nonsense. And sometimes, the loudest justice is silence, the kind that follows when truth finally shuts the last door behind a storm that never should have started.